Real photos of World War II. You shouldn't see. Photos. Historical. The silent echoes of histories. Shadows. Step into the depths of untold history, where the echoes of human resilience and tragedy still whisper through time. Welcome to a journey through the unseen corners of the past, where every name and image carries the weight of a forgotten cry. Subscribe to remain part of this ongoing act of remembrance, where truth is honored and silence is broken. Among the countless souls caught in the tide of Nazi terror, one stands with haunting clarity. Janusz Korczak, a Polish Jewish doctor, writer, and devoted educator who ran an orphanage in Nazi-occupied Warsaw. As the shadow of deportation loomed in August 1942, and his 200 orphans were ordered to Treblinka extermination camp, Korczak was offered safety multiple times. Yet he chose to remain with his children, offering them the comfort of his presence in their final hours. He marched with them, not as a prisoner, but as a protector, meeting his death in the gas chambers alongside the innocent lives he vowed never to abandon. In another piercing fragment of horror, a photograph from Ukraine in 1942 captures the moment a Nazi soldier raises his rifle at a woman shielding her child, her body a fragile barrier against a monstrous ideology. This chilling image reflects the operations of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that swept through Eastern Europe, executing Jews, political dissidents, and civilians in remote fields and forests. These massacres, often preceded by forced trench digging, were part of a broader campaign of terror where Nazis even conscripted criminals into brutal special units, enacting revenge on civilians and Soviet prisoners in what became known as Hitler's Dirty Dozen. These atrocities, often shrouded in silence, demand to be remembered, not for their cruelty alone, but for the humanity that persevered in their midst. 2. Whispers of courage in the darkness of tyranny. In a world disfigured by war and drowned in silence, where terror ruled and justice vanished, there existed not only monsters, but also martyrs, rebels, and forgotten heroes. Close your eyes and step deeper into this shadowed history, where every breath of defiance became a final act of freedom, and every life lost whispered an eternal warning. The Nazi regime, in its hunger for domination, unleashed not only trained soldiers, but also formed legions of chaos, psychopaths, rapists, and murderers given full license to kill, humiliate, and destroy. This division of human darkness roamed the occupied lands of Eastern Europe, dragging thousands of innocent people to shallow trenches carved into cold soil where life was extinguished without trial, without mercy, part of a calculated policy of fear meant to strangle resistance before it could breathe. Yet even in this atmosphere of suffocation, flames of courage erupted. La Parade, a teenage peasant girl from Yugoslavia, joined the resistance against the Nazis while barely 17. Captured while fighting as a partisan, she was imprisoned, tortured, and beaten, yet remained silent, protecting her comrades with unbreakable loyalty. On February 8, 1943, she was hanged publicly, but her final words, defiant and unshaken, foretold a reckoning. You will know them when they come to avenge me. Her voice still echoes, defying oblivion. Another beacon of daring was Witold Pilecki, a Polish officer who volunteered to infiltrate Auschwitz. Inside the camp of nightmares, he built a resistance network and documented atrocities unseen by the outside world. After 3 years, he escaped, survived, and later spoke out against the creeping authoritarianism of post-war communism in Poland. His truth, became his sentence. Accused of espionage, tortured, and executed in 1948, his name was buried by the regime he had once sought to protect. But history remembers. As the Nazi Empire crumbled, young lives were still entangled in its ruins. Alfred Czech, a 12-year-old boy, was decorated with the Iron Cross after rescuing wounded soldiers under heavy fire, using only his father's cart. He was shot in the lung, captured by the Soviets, and returned home years later to find his father dead, a brutal end to a boy's brief, tragic heroism. And in the shadows of espionage, Christine Granville, born Christina Skarbek, emerged as one of Britain's most daring spies. A Polish aristocrat turned agent, she escaped the Gestapo by feigning tuberculosis, biting her tongue until it bled, convincing her captors of her frailty. She rescued prisoners, gathered intelligence, and slipped through danger again and again. But the war forgot her. In 1952, she died poor and unrecognized in London, another silent casualty of peace, a hero mourned too late. 3. When humanity was silenced, beyond the veil of history's surface lies a realm few dare to truly enter, a place not defined by battles or borders, but by the cold machinery of cruelty and the quiet resistance of the human spirit. As we drift deeper into these darkest chapters, allow the voices of the lost to rise once more, their stories not buried in numbers, but carved into memory. In the Nazi concentration camps, daily life was dictated by terror. Prisoners were forced to endure roll calls under the watchful eyes of guards, their names reduced to numbers, their existence stripped of dignity. In places like Auschwitz, the so-called selection awaited new arrivals. Here, under the indifferent gaze of SS doctors, people were judged in moments. Those deemed fit for forced labor were separated from the rest, who were marched unknowingly toward the gas chambers. Families were torn apart in an instant, the line between life and death invisible and irrevocable. Women, children, and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, during 1944, trainloads of Jewish families arrived daily. Deceived with false promises of showers and rest, they were led to their deaths. Nearly 1 million Jews perished in that camp alone. Yet the horror of human annihilation stretched far beyond Europe. In Nanking, China, during the Japanese occupation that began in December 1937, tens of thousands of civilians were rounded up. With hands bound and eyes pleading, they were transported to the city's outskirts, where they faced mass execution, trench burials, and acts of unspeakable violence. Over 200,000 were killed in a campaign designed to instill fear and establish dominance through terror. Among the countless victims of Nazi brutality was Czesława Kwoka, a 14-year-old Polish Catholic girl deported to Auschwitz during the forced Germanization of Poland. In her haunting photograph, fear and bruises speak louder than words, the aftermath of beatings by guards. Not long after her image was captured, she was murdered with a phenol injection to the heart. Thousands of children like her shared the same fate. Innocent lives extinguished before they could even begin. 4. Ashes, echoes, and the ghosts of mercy. In the aftermath of horror, when the world was still smoldering and silence weighed heavier than rubble, history left behind fragments, whispers etched into stone, flame, and broken lives. Let us walk into these remnants not as distant observers, but as witnesses to a time when the human soul was tested beyond comprehension. On June 10, 1944, in the quiet French village of Oradour-sur-Glane, peace was shattered by unspeakable violence. Nazi troops stormed the town, herding 643 civilians, mostly women and children, into the church. Locked inside, they were burned alive as gunfire and smoke choked the village into silence. The lone survivor, little Roger Godfrey, escaped the massacre by a miracle, his voice the only living echo of a place now preserved in ruins as a solemn memorial to that horrific day. In the shadows of such brutality, acts of remembrance took on a sacred form. In 1966, a Soviet veteran, legless and leaning on a makeshift skateboard, bowed before the eternal flame, a gesture of reverence for the 14 million Soviet soldiers who fell in World War II. For survivors like him, trauma endured long after the gunfire ceased, and these quiet moments of tribute became unspoken cries of grief and loyalty. Yet even in liberation, violence left its mark. On May 7, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender, joyful crowds filled Dam Square in Amsterdam. But their celebration turned to chaos when German sailors opened fire on civilians, killing up to 32 people in a senseless act that turned triumph into tragedy. Amid war's cruelty, however, flickers of humanity persisted. American doctors, bound by their oath, treated wounded soldiers, including those wearing SS uniforms, reminding the world that even in the face of evil, compassion could survive. To see the human in the enemy was not weakness, but the last act of moral resistance in a world on fire. A quiet rebellion against hatred that sought to make monsters of us all. 5. Hunger, silence, and the shattered face of innocence. Beyond the battlefields and speeches, far from the headlines and flags, lies a darker truth carved into the margins of history. A reality of broken bodies, starved souls, and silent suffering. Enter a realm where survival was not measured in victories, but in breaths stolen from death itself. During World War II, across the occupied zones of Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, prison camps became living graves. Under armed watch, detainees, both civilians and soldiers, endured inhuman conditions. With fewer than 600 calories a day, their bodies withered under the weight of forced labor, building railways, runways, and fortresses for regimes that denied them identity. Diseases like dysentery, scurvy, and infections ravaged the camps, turning even time into a weapon. To cling to sanity, many prisoners wrote in secret diaries, fragile acts of rebellion against the erasure of their humanity. In some camps, 1 in every 3 prisoners died, their stories buried in silence. And while grown men faded behind barbed wire, children faced horrors no words could mend. In 1939, as German bombs rained down on Warsaw during the opening days of the invasion of Poland, a young girl named Kazimiera Mika, just 12 years old, was photographed kneeling beside her sister's lifeless body. Her tear-streaked face, twisted in confusion and despair, became a symbol of innocence betrayed by war. The image captured a single raw truth. For those caught beneath the roar of power, even understanding becomes a casualty. 6. Echoes of smoke, silence, and shadows of the Second World War. Step softly now into the echoes of a world on fire, a time when every breath was uncertain and the future trembled beneath the weight of collapsing empires and shattered innocence. The Second World War was not only waged in trenches and skies, but etched itself into the smallest corners of everyday life. Its reach extending into classrooms, cities, jungles, and human hearts. In Britain, even children were not spared from the looming fear of annihilation. In 1941, gas masks became as common as school books, and British children marched in quiet lines, their faces hidden behind rubber masks that muffled childhood. The threat of chemical warfare hung heavy, and in towns like Kingston, drills used actual tear gas to prepare school children for the unthinkable. Millions of gas masks were handed out across the United Kingdom, each a silent symbol of dread and preparation. But even such fears paled in comparison to what would follow. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was obliterated in an instant as the first atomic bomb reduced nearly 70% of it to ash. Around 70,000 people died immediately, but the toll climbed to over 140,000 in the months that followed, consumed by radiation and fire. Those who survived the hibakusha bore deep physical scars and lived with psychological wounds that never healed. While cities were burning, hidden horrors unfolded across occupied Asia. An estimated 50,000 to 200,000 women from China, Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military, known as comfort women. Many were deceived into believing they would work as nurses or cooks, only to be imprisoned in military brothels where they endured daily abuse, unable to flee, resist, or be heard. Their stolen youth became one of the most haunting silences of war. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Guam, Shoichi Yokoi, a Japanese soldier unaware that peace had come, lived in isolation for nearly 30 years. When he was finally discovered in 1972 by hunters, he emerged as a living ghost of the past. Upon returning to Japan, he bowed before the cameras and whispered, "I am ashamed to have returned alive," a phrase that revealed the depth of loyalty, sacrifice, and shame rooted in the Japanese military culture. In another corner of history, the world shifted as columns of smoke rose from Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, two women in military housing stared at the sky, noticing planes with red insignias. Then came the explosions. The USS Arizona was consumed by fire, with more than 1,000 men entombed inside. Sailors scrambled to respond as hangars, aircraft, and lives were destroyed in moments. The attack killed over 2,400 people and plunged the United States into war the very next day, reshaping the global tide. Yet war did not only break bones, it broke spirits. At Dachau, as the gates finally opened and the living were freed, the blank stare of an 18-year-old Russian girl captured a deeper truth. Emaciated, silent, unable to process what freedom even meant, her expression was one shared by countless survivors, living testaments to how liberation did not end suffering, but merely marked a new, uncertain beginning. In Saipan in 1944, Marines paused in grim silence as one of their own neared collapse. Battle fatigue was not a term then, but its reality was relentless. Sleep deprivation, brutal combat, unbearable heat, and the weight of loss hollowed out even the strongest. The war's damage was invisible just as often as it was seen. And so we remember Ira Hayes, a Native American Marine who helped raise the flag on Iwo Jima, his image forever frozen in a photograph of triumph. But after the war, he fought another battle, one against trauma, neglect, and alcoholism. Despite being a national hero, he died alone in the desert, frozen and forgotten, haunted not by the enemy, but by the silence within. The Second World War ended on paper, but in minds, hearts, and memories, it echoes still. Smoke lingering in the distance, footsteps in ruins, and stares that ask not to be forgotten. 7. The war that never left. Fragments of humanity amid ruin. Enter a world where silence was louder than bombs, where each breath carried the weight of loss, and every glance was a mirror reflecting the pain of an entire generation. Let your senses absorb the forgotten stillness between battles, the lingering touch of grief on skin, the hollow stares of boys sent to die before they ever learned how to live. This is not just a tale of armies and conquests. It is the unfolding of shattered childhoods, stolen farewells, fleeting compassion, and the unbearable cost of survival. Beneath the scorching sun of the Egyptian desert, a British soldier stands in silence before the grave of a comrade who fell from the sky, the wind lifting dust from the sand as he reads an inscription etched by the enemy. Here lies an unknown English lieutenant, killed in air combat. In a rare moment of shared humanity, German troops had honored a fallen rival, proof that even in war, respect could transcend uniform. As the war neared its brutal end, Hans-Georg Henke, a 16-year-old anti-aircraft assistant, was captured by American forces. His tear-streaked face, caught in a haunting photo, became one of the final portraits of Nazi Germany's collapse. He was not alone. Germany and the Soviet Union both sent teenagers to the front lines in desperate last attempts. Many were just 15 or 16, still growing into their own skin when they were forced into battles like Stalingrad, where they either died far from home or returned forever changed. In the frozen outskirts near Moscow in December 1941, an elderly woman clung to a young Soviet soldier, tears of fear and hope mixing as she embraced him. The tide had begun to turn. Siberian troops, hardened by the cold, had arrived and launched a ferocious counteroffensive in Galiciano that halted the Nazi advance and lit the first sparks of Soviet resurgence. But the end of war was not universal. While Europe celebrated on May 8, 1945, American soldiers fighting in Okinawa listened to news of Germany's surrender with a heavy stillness. Their war was not over. The Pacific still burned. In the fields and caves of Okinawa, they faced weeks of brutal combat, losing over 12,500 comrades, while 77,000 Japanese troops perished. Colonel Francis Fenton, in one of the war's most heartbreaking images, knelt before the coffin of his own son, Private Mike Fenton, who had died on the same front. Amid unending combat, the 1,000-yard stare crept into the faces of surviving soldiers, eyes fixed on nothing, seeing too much. For many, it would never fade. War's reach stretched beyond the battlefield. In 1956, a German soldier returned home after 12 years in Soviet captivity and met his son for the first time. Their embrace was tender, hesitant, one man a stranger in uniform, the other a child now grown. Time had stolen what bullets hadn't. A father's presence, a childhood never lived together. On the front lines of Voronezh in 1942, a Soviet commissar stood tall from a trench, pistol raised, leading a charge through gunfire. Seconds later, he was dead. One of countless sacrifices in the desperate Soviet stand to halt Germany's summer advance toward the Volga. War shaped cultures, beliefs, even surrender. On a remote island in the Pacific, a Japanese prisoner stripped before American Marines in January 1944, showing he carried no explosives. It was a rare break from the doctrine of death before capture, a deeply ingrained belief in the Japanese military that surrender was shame. In the Netherlands, quiet resistance took the form of prayer. Villagers knelt in silence in 1941, honoring neighbors taken by the Nazis. Though peaceful, their defiance was dangerous. Many were arrested, but their prayers joined a rising tide of strikes and faith-driven protests sparked by the first Jewish deportations, proof that even silence can be revolutionary. On the bitter path of the Bataan Death March in April 1942, exhausted American and Filipino prisoners stumbled under the sun, hands bound, wounded comrades carried between them. More than 60 miles under brutal heat, without food or water, left thousands dead before they reached the camps. This was not war. It was survival against cruelty, where every step was a gamble with death. On D-Day, Omaha Beach became a slaughterhouse before dawn. Waves of American soldiers fell before even reaching the sand. But amid the screams and explosions, some wounded still crawled forward, driven by a force beyond fear. More than 2,400 were killed, wounded, or went missing in that single battle for the beach. The war reached deep into cities and homes. During the Blitz, London crumbled under nightly bombings. 1 million homes were damaged, hospitals, schools, and families shattered. In the rubble, British soldiers pulled stunned and injured children from the wreckage, racing time to find survivors. In the snow near Leningrad, German soldiers froze in makeshift trenches. The siege was merciless, and the cold itself became a weapon. Temperatures dropped below 22 degrees. Food was scarce, and limbs blackened from gangrene. Weapons jammed, engines failed, and many died not from bullets, but from frost and despair. In Karachev in 1943, a young Russian recruit said goodbye to his family. His mother held his hand, knowing too well she might never see him again. The USSR conscripted over 34 million civilians. Farewells like this were burned into the hearts of Soviet villages, quiet moments before chaos. In Singapore, after Japanese bombings devastated the city in 1942, a father and daughter sat quietly among the rubble, eating rice. They did not speak. The ruins around them were louder than words. Just days earlier, the British had believed Singapore unbreakable. Now, over 80,000 Allied soldiers were prisoners in one of the Empire's greatest defeats. Among the final snapshots of wartime sorrow, a 5-year-old boy ran toward his father boarding a train for the front. The man turned, just for a second, to lift the child into his arms. Mothers wept, children pressed hands to glass, and trains pulled away carrying men toward uncertainty. Many of those fathers never returned. And so, history did not end in parades or peace treaties. It lingers at the embrace of a returning soldier, the shadow of a plane, the smell of scorched stone. It lives in the haunted eyes of the young, the silence of the old, and the whispered names etched in forgotten graves. This is not just the story of a world at war. It is the echo of lives interrupted and of a humanity that, even in the ruins, never stopped reaching out. 8. What Remains After Fire. A journey through ashes and survival. Step back into the stillness that followed the final thunder, when the bombs ceased, but the silence screamed louder than war. The end of conflict did not mean the end of suffering. For many, it was the beginning of another kind of battle, one fought in ruins, in memory, in the aching search for what no longer existed. In 1946, a German prisoner of war returned to Frankfurt only to find his home reduced to rubble, his family vanished into the void of war's chaos. He was one of thousands. Frankfurt had been bombed more than 70 times, leaving over 4,000 civilians dead and much of the city erased. Elsewhere in Germany, cities like Dresden and Hamburg became infernos. Entire neighborhoods turned to smoke, whole communities erased in nights of firestorms. For returning soldiers, home was now only a word, a memory scattered in dust. In Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers waded through mud, smoke, and frozen blood, advancing inch by inch through a shattered city where even the air seemed to resist life. Between 1942 and 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad became one of history's most brutal confrontations, marked by starvation, close-quarters combat, and unspeakable loss. Over 2 million perished in this urban nightmare, where every block was a battlefield and survival itself became a miracle. Yet destruction was not limited to the front. In Warsaw, a home for children with disabilities was struck during a bombing, leaving behind only twisted beds and silence. The dead included not only children but the nurses who cared for them. Even marked humanitarian buildings were no refuge. War shattered not just brick and mortar, but the very belief that any place could be safe. And in April 1945, as starvation gripped the Netherlands, salvation came not with guns, but with parachutes. In Operation Mana, British planes flew over occupied territory, dropping more than 6,600 tons of food to desperate civilians. People ran into the streets, waving handkerchiefs, reaching skyward for survival as nourishment rained down before the war had even officially ended. A rare act of mercy in a world still burning. 9. Between ashes and echoes, unfolding the forgotten faces of war. Open your mind and step into a world where silence was often louder than gunfire, where shadows stretched across bombed-out cities and hearts broke in quiet corners no history book could fully capture. Let your thoughts drift not through the dates and battles, but through the whispers of those who lived, who suffered, who loved and were lost in the whirlwind of the Second World War. This is not just the story of a global conflict. It is the mosaic of shattered lives, splinters of humanity that survived amid ruins, prayers, and pain. David, a young Dutch Jewish man, was once passionate about philosophy and history. But in 1941, his studies were cut short when Jewish students were banned from university. Despite the rising danger, his family did not hide, holding on to a fragile exemption that would ultimately prove to be an illusion. In 1943, David and his brother Rudolf were captured and sent to Voot camp. There, stripped of freedom, he wrote one of the war's most heartbreaking diaries, preserving his thoughts with a clarity that would outlive him. While souls like David fought their own silent wars, Red Cross soldiers and military nurses moved through ruins, tending to the wounded, especially children, with only bandages and faith. Hospitals had been flattened, resources reduced to scraps, but these moments of care became lifelines in lands where mercy was rare. Across Europe and beyond, more than 60 million people fled their homes. Jews, Poles, Belgians, the displaced and dispossessed, pushing wheelbarrows, carrying babies, walking for miles, with nothing but fear and the faint hope of survival. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, Stalin sat in silence on June 22, 1941, receiving word of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. In its wake came shock, staggering Soviet losses, and the first notes of a brutal campaign that would consume over 20 million Soviet lives. On the island of Saipan in 1944, Japanese civilians hid in caves, trembling as smoke grenades signaled the advance of American forces. A mother and her child emerged slowly from one such cavern, eyes wide with fear, their confusion mirroring the collapse of a war-torn world. And as cities fell and dust settled, German women were forced to clean streets in places like Berlin and Prague, sweeping debris under watchful eyes, a symbolic gesture of forced atonement and the bitter beginning of rebuilding. On the island of Peleliu, a United States Marine collapsed amid dirt and blood, undone by heat, exhaustion, and the violence that shattered both body and mind. The battle claimed over 10,000 American lives and revealed a truth far darker than strategy. The war consumed men entirely. In Vienna in 1947, a mother held up a photo to a newly freed Austrian prisoner, desperate for a sign of her missing son. This act repeated itself endlessly across Europe, as fragments of memory became the last thread connecting war's survivors to those who vanished. Even animals bore the cost of the Blitz. In South London, amid the ruins, rescue workers found puppies curled in dust, saved by children who refused to abandon them. Thousands of pets were lost in bombings, yet their survival brought flickers of light to war's darkest nights. In 1943, a German soldier trudged through the harsh terrain of the Caucasus, hollow-eyed and near collapse. Disease, hunger, and cold claimed more than 200,000 lives on that front alone. Letters, often the only touch of home, became prayers. In Iwo Jima, soldiers clutched messages from loved ones like relics, rereading them in whispers as artillery thundered in the distance. On torn roads across Europe, civilians fled with wheelbarrows and baby carriages, carrying the elderly or injured with nothing but willpower and trembling hope. In that same desperation, a British soldier knelt in prayer, alone among empty benches, while others gathered in fields and churches. Faith, fragile as it was, offered brief refuge from the horror. As the Nazis surged through Eastern Europe, the Red Army adopted scorched earth tactics, torching farms and homes in Belarus and Ukraine to slow the advance. Millions of Soviet civilians were caught in the inferno, starving, freezing, displaced by the very soldiers meant to protect them. Wounded veterans returned with limbs missing, their silhouettes now symbols of endurance. Over 1 million soldiers came home with amputations, some celebrated in parades, others left to battle depression and rejection in a world they no longer recognized. Still, amid destruction, humanity clung on. A Soviet prisoner, under enemy eyes, knelt beside a wounded comrade while tanks burned behind them, showing that brotherhood could survive even in captivity. During the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, one exhausted German soldier slumped in the snow, his image captured as Germany's final offensive broke against Allied resolve. Some said his name was Hans Tarski, a face lost in the cold white of surrender. In East London, children sat silently among bombed-out homes, clutching broken toys, their faces blank with shock. 1 million houses were damaged during the Blitz, and thousands of children were left with nothing but rubble for shelter. In southern Italy, German soldiers sheltered in the wreckage of homes during the fierce Battle of Monte Cassino, while in Leningrad and Warsaw, hunger ruled. People traded wedding rings for bread, children scavenged ruins for crumbs, and every meal was a miracle. In the skies over London, a German bomber released a rain of destruction on September 20th, 1940, part of another long night of fire during the Blitz. More than 350 high-explosive bombs fell, setting the city ablaze. The Palace of Westminster glowed from the fires, a symbol of survival amid the onslaught. By the war's end, more than 43,000 civilians had died in British air raids alone. These moments, personal, haunting, and deeply human, are not merely the past. They are threads in the fabric of today's freedom, warnings whispered across generations. To honor them is not just to remember, but to feel. If these stories moved you, if these faces stirred something within you, then help keep them alive. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so their memories continue to echo far beyond the silence. Let us carry them forward, not as relics, but as reminders that even in humanity's darkest hours, light still dared to shine.
you.